about free trade and the latest free trade monstrosity, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But just to introduce this discussion, let me refer to the Washington Post headline of today, Friday, the 17th of January. The free trade lift. Scary stories about the Trans-Pacific Partnership don't hold up to scrutiny. So the Washington Post, in its great wisdom, this is now Bezos talking, not even the Graham family, huh? Not Donald Graham, but Jeff Bezos, a real predator if there ever was one. Free trade agreement of the U.S. and 11 Pacific Rim countries are now under attack. The claims are that this deal will destroy U.S. jobs and make income inequality worse. So if Obama's talking about helping the middle class to overcome income inequality, he's doing the opposite. So this is a very weak defense because this thing is this TPP. This is virtually indefensible. And they say, oh, well, it's really only Vietnam is the only real sweatshop, extreme poverty country. And the U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam is only $16 billion, and it's only likely to double, and that would really not change anything in the overall U.S. trade balance. Look at the difference between the way these ruling class characters treat the budget deficit and the trade deficit. In reality, from the point of view of real economics, the trade deficit is much more of a problem than the domestic budget deficit. But they don't seem to care about that. They're going to have trade deficits as far as the eye can see, and they say, well, the deficit with Vietnam could double. They're essentially telling us that for the 35 years after World War II, there was a kind of a lost paradise, a golden age of income equality in the United States. But that can't be done anymore because there's no insulation from imports. Well, there can be. It's called a 15% revenue tariff, or in today's world, that would actually be a protective tariff. But we need to get a rundown on the many monstrosities of TPP. So I'd like to go to Wisconsin and Polly Hughes, who is a founding member of the United Front Against Austerity, and she has been doing, I think, a very important in-depth study of the TPP, what it would actually do. And hold on to your hat, because these are indeed scary stories. Polly, welcome.
Thank you, Webster. Good afternoon.
So I was on a conference call with you last Sunday, and you gave an excellent summary, and I'd just like you to go to it right now. Just give us that rundown that you had.
Oh, yeah, I'd like to tell everybody about these outrageously restrictive trade agreements, what they are, what legislation's out there, and then, of course, talk about the solution that you just said, 15% protective tariff. The TPA is a trade promotion authority, which is better known as fast track. Everybody's talking about. That's been proposed to allow President Obama to sign trade agreements and then take them to Congress. Now, the bad part really is with this is that Congress's power would be very limited. They would have limited time for debate. Congress could put no amendments, and there would be no filibustering allowed. So Congress would only be able to take an up or down vote. That's it. In 2002, Congress approved the Fast Track Authority for President George W. Bush. It expired in 2007, but Obama, he and his administration has been negotiating 3 trade accords for about the last 5 years. The first one is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, with 11 other nations, including Vietnam. The second trade accord is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is the TTIP, with 28 European countries. And the third trade agreement is Global Services Pact, which would be with about 50 nations. So this is why the White House wants to get fast-tracked approved. And by the way, Webster, the TPP has been dubbed NAFTA on steroids.
Mm.
And I want to tell you...
Didn't we also have a deal with South Korea?
South Korea that's separate. This is not in the TPP. The 11 nations with the U.S. in the TPP are Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and Japan.
Mm-hmm.
For 5 years, the TPP has been in negotiations behind closed doors, so it's total secrecy, but some 600 corporate trade advisors, they've been called, industry leaders, big corporations, have online access to the working text. But Congress does not. Congress has not been allowed to see what's being negotiated for these past 5 years. Just recently, a committee of Congress was allowed to read the proposed agreement, the TPP, and they were allowed to see it, but they could not take notes. They could not make copies. Nothing could leave that room. So it was just a few congressmen in a room. Here's the agreement. Take a quick look at it, and then go past fast track for President Obama to do what he wants. One senator even has been tweeting about how bad TPP is, but he isn't allowed to tell us why.
Which senator is that?
That's Senator Grayson. Senator Alan Grayson has been tweeting that quite a lot.
That's Congressman Alan Grayson, Florida, right?
Yeah, Alan Grayson, I think he's in Florida. I'm not positive where he is, but he's the one he's pretty vocal about a lot of things. He's been very vocal the last couple of weeks. Obama has also been, again, negotiating in secrecy and pushing for the fast track. And again, I want to say this again, Congress would have limited debate time. They could only vote up and down with no amendments and no filibustering. I can't imagine Congress going along with it. But now, we don't have the agreement. We can't see it. But WikiLeaks has been leaking some of the chapters from what they can find. A lot of it's about environment, some of it's about internet and corporations and lawsuits. So I want to just give everybody just some basic tenets that we think are in the TPP. First one is that it would. Oh, is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. First thing would be it would relinquish our rights to regulate within our own borders. So in other words, corporations would be the rulers. Decisions would not be made by each country. Decisions would be made by a global business tribunal. The TPP would also create special protections and remove global barriers for these too-big-to-fail banks, Wall Street, etc., but they would not offer protections to smaller community banks. Another tenet of the TPP we think will be to give preferred investor state status to foreign companies that would operate within our borders. So ultimately, that would encourage U.S. companies to offshore even more jobs than we have now.
Okay, hang on. The music is telling us a break is at hand. We're going to get you back in the next segment to learn more about the monstrosity of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tupley in Washington, and we're on the line with Polly Hughes in Wisconsin. And Polly is one of the leading authorities on this den of iniquity, this tissue of monstrosity, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think the point that we had reached, Polly, was that foreign companies get preferential treatment. I just want to point out, yes. Remember when Obama ran for president the first time, 2008, he promised that he would review NAFTA, and at the same time he said this, he sent his minion, Austin the Ghoul Goolsby, to the Canadian embassy to reassure the Canadians, saying he doesn't mean it. That's just demagogy. That's for the Mickeys. That's rube bait. We're going to be free traders, as indeed he has been. So Obama got into office on false pretenses on that, and now he's acting it out. But please continue.
Yeah, he's just flip-flopped. Okay, so the next tenet I wanted to talk about is that it would lower wages for U.S. workers, something you were talking about before you introduced me. It would exempt foreign companies from environmental regulations. It would affect consumer protections for food safety. TPP would destroy collective bargaining and threaten already established worker protections. And remember, the Buy American programs, the Buy Local programs, Webster, that would come to a halt. And there are a couple ways we think the TPP would do that. The TPP would allow foreign companies to underbid U.S. companies on government contracts that are paid for with our tax dollars, for one thing. And another way would be the TPP would allow foreign investors to actually file lawsuits in a global business court that would challenge buy local programs. These foreign investors can claim that buy local is unfair and would allow foreign investors to ask for compensation even for anticipated lost profits.
Let me just point out this CGI Federal, right? The greatest debacle of recent Obama administration history. The failed initiation and launch of the Obamacare website. That foreign contractor, that Canadian computer company, CGI Federal, has now been fired. But it sounds like with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you'd be stuck with these foreign bunglers forever. Exactly. As a good example. The TPP would also threaten to extend restrictive intellectual property laws, and that would impose sanctions with respect to pharmaceutical patents, which would, of course, end up raising the cost of prescription medicines for us, and they're already high enough. Internet restrictions, another biggie. ISPs could become censors and block content sharing between individuals. There's a lot about Monsanto and GMOs. TPP would remove restrictions on U.S. standards for GMOs, which would basically make it impossible for Americans to know what we're even eating from these other countries, and that would threaten Europe's ban on GMOs, the genetically modified organisms. It also would encourage fracking and drilling. It would threaten environmental protections. Basically, it would strip the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, of its power to control the damage that's being done by fracking. And I know, with many protesters on that. We'd all be on our way to those West Virginia counties, right? We've had that chemical spill in West Virginia with that British corporate spokesman coming out, right? Just like BP in the Gulf, it was the British who came out and did the talking. Yes, we'd have more and more of that. We'd have no recourse. There's nothing we could do about it. TPP would also drive up energy prices. The DOE would lose regulatory authority over fuel imports and exports. So oil and natural gas could be sold on the open market to the highest bidders. So those are the basic tenets that organizations that are looking at the WikiLeaks documents pretty much have come up with. That's pretty much what the TPP would bring us. Now, if we have time, I'll tell you what happened last week and this week. Go right ahead. We go to the end of the segment, so go to it. Okay. Last week, January 6th through 10, some legislation was proposed to pass the fast track. The ones who proposed it were Senator Baucus, the Democrat of Montana, who's also the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. He's also Obama's nominee for ambassador to China. Along with tool of the corporations. Pardon me? He's a tool of the corporations and Wall Street, a stooge, not a Democrat in any sense. He's a Wall Street Democrat. There we go. Senator Hatch of Utah, the committee's senior Republican, he's the second senator. And then there's a Representative Dave Camp, who's the Republican from Michigan. He's also the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. A Tea Party extremist. Yes, Camp, Hatch, and Baucus all got together and proposed legislation to pass fast track. Then Representative Sander Levin of Michigan, he's the senior Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee, said he would introduce a rival measure that would give Congress more say over the final terms of any agreement, which isn't exactly proposing the opposite. It's not like he's saying, no, we're not going to fast track. We're not going to pass fast track. He simply wants to put in some kind of proposal that would change. He wants to cover his posteriors. He wants to cut. Yeah, you're right. You can say it nicely. Yes, he wants to. He wanted to look like the good guy, but not actually be the good guy. Because that's Michigan, right? Michigan, of course, is in wonderful shape thanks to these treaties. Yes, that's Levin of Michigan. And then separately from all that, there was a letter signed by 151 Democrats that was in opposition. I don't have the transcript, so I don't know a lot about it, but supposedly this letter went to Obama and Harry Reid about opposing fast track. And that was last week. And then this week, yesterday. The point people have to understand is they're saying no to fast track. They're not saying no to free trade or no to the TPP. They're just saying You're cutting us out. We want to make some money as it goes through.
Exactly. Congress, this is the first baby step with Obama trying to get full authority and Congress pushing back. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to have TPP and TTIP and this other global pact. No. But the fast track is what's on everybody's minds right now. That has to be passed first, or at least Obama wants that passed first. Now, what happened this week? Yesterday was pretty busy. Thursday, the 16th. A second letter went to Harry Reid, and that was signed by 12 senators, 11 Democrats, and 1 independent. I don't have the transcript, but I do have some pretty much the basics and one quote from that letter. The letter basically states that TPP and TTIP would remove power from Washington and transfer it to corporate tribunals. This letter has a little more behind it, I think, than this just fast track. I hope so anyway. The national corporations would become the most powerful legal entities in the world, and they would be making all the economic decisions. That's in this letter, that they don't like. The previous trade bills have been detrimental to workers and national competitiveness, and the letter states something about the harm being done to America's manufacturing sector especially, and it stated that the trade deals that we already have, like NAFTA, have hurt, not helped American companies. I do have one quote from the letter, and it states, "We believe any package should include provisions to address currency manipulation, stronger mechanisms to address unfair labor practices, the ability of communities to preserve their values, strong trade enforcement policies, and should provide innovative solutions to finance improvements to our crumbling infrastructure." I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric, but of course it doesn't come up with a real solution like you talked about, the 15% protective tariff on all.
Okay, Polly, I would invite you to be our Trans-Pacific Partnership correspondent, and when we get important developments, we'll talk to you in the coming weeks, right? We want to follow the attempts of the left liberals and the trade union bureaucrats to do something about this, but they're not going to succeed at the current rate. But thank you very much, and we'll see you in the coming weeks.